Recently, we've done quite a few videos about the clones of the Grand Army of the Republic, especially individuals from major units like the 501st Legion, and trust me, there are plenty more coming. With all the focus on the 501st and elite clone units in Star Wars The Clone Wars, it's sometimes easy to forget they were actually the exception, not the norm. In the 501st Legion, we see a tight-knit unit of men that consider themselves brothers to each other, independent and united. However, most other clones were much different. In this video, we'll be discussing just that. Unfortunately, the Grand Army of the Republic wasn't all sunshine and defectiveness like the 501st was. As we've said before, the Kaminoans were a-holes and perfectionists to boot. When they were contracted to create a massive clone army, they had no intentions of making millions of independent, individual-minded clones. They intended to breed millions of living droids, compliant, unquestioning, order-driven soldiers with little sense of individuality, different from battle droids only in their physical makeup and their superior intellect and imaginative abilities. There were, of course, exceptions to this rule. Clone commandos were trained very differently, with more of an emphasis on thinking for yourself, while ARC troopers were, as Karen Travers put it, pretty much pure Django. But the majority of clone troopers were meant to think for themselves only insofar as battlefield improvisation was concerned. Tactical thinking was left to specially trained clone officers. The standard clone trooper was only supposed to receive orders and follow them to the letter, taking the initiative on only when absolutely necessary. Clone troopers were still highly trained, don't get me wrong, they were taught exhaustive amounts of information about pretty much anything they would possibly need to know. They were trained in the use of a wide variety of weapons, and they all knew how to operate the formidable set of gear that each of them was given. But even in the officers, individual thought and tactical creativity wasn't very pronounced, which led to Alpha 17 retraining a large number of them to be more like ARC troopers, and a better fit for their roles as command liaisons for the Jedi as a result. Perhaps the most stark difference between the clones we know and love and the rank and file clones of the Grand Army of the Republic is individuality. The clones we see in Star Wars The Clone Wars are very much all individuals. They have nicknames, distinct personalities, and they think for themselves. But to the Kaminoans, individuality was a defect. If any standard clone trooper showed these traits in training, they would have been euthanized without a second thought. Evidently, some of them slipped through, but many more didn't. Instead, the clone troopers were taught to think of themselves not as individuals, but as parts of units. They were bred to have little to no regard for their own lives, and taught that if one could save their unit by sacrificing their own life, then it should be done without a second thought. Clones thought of themselves as squads or platoons, or more often as the larger units to which they were assigned. This sort of collectivist hive mind way of thinking is actually a large part of why the Grand Army of the Republic was such a force to be reckoned with. Even outright programming can't compare to that kind of undying hive-minded loyalty. Furthermore, the acts of rebellion that the men of the 501st displayed would never even be considered by standard clone troopers. Pong Krell's orders and methods of warfare seem callous and unusual when we see them in the Umbara arc, but they were actually the norm. There's a reason Krell was surprised at the defiance that the 501st showed him. The units that Krell had commanded before likely would have obeyed such tactics without any hesitation, because that's what they were supposed to do. As Krell suggests in the arc, the men of the 501st are indeed defective, just in a good way. In no case does this unquestioning obedience show more than that of Commander Fey. We've discussed Fey in brief recently. He was the clone liaison for Opa Rancisis before his death, and for Quinlan Vos afterwards. Vos hated him, and for good reason. He had no sense of improvisation or individual thought, and was loyal to the Grand Army of the Republic and only the Grand Army of the Republic. He did whatever protocol said he should do in any given situation, and would refuse to budge from it, even when Vos ordered it at times. Though Fey was an extreme and mildly sociopathic case, his general attitude was reflected by most clone troopers. This, for the record, is why Quinlan Vos hated clones. Nicknames were also much more of a private thing for most clones than is depicted in the show. The majority didn't even have nicknames, they went by their numbers and left it at that. Those that did develop nicknames considered them a private thing. To paraphrase the Essential Guide to Warfare, most clones considered their nicknames the business of only themselves, their batches, and their commanding officers. To everyone else, they were just a number, and most of them were adamant about keeping it that way, as the Kaminoans probably would have euthanized clones that they discovered were going primarily by nicknames. But back to our original bit of clickbait, would most clones consider each other brothers? No, not really. Clones saw their batches as brothers. They were the men that they had grown up with, trained with, and gotten to know. But most of them would not have thought the same of men in other units or even other platoons within their unit. Brother implies a very close familial connection, one which most clones simply don't feel with the rest of the Grand Army. As we've said before, they consider themselves parts within the whole, but this was more of a collective relationship than a fraternal one. For most clones, the concepts of brotherhood and individuality were limited to what the Kaminoans called birth cohorts. Clone troopers were organized into these units right out of the tube, and most remain in them for the rest of their lives. These birth cohorts were each given sections in the barracks and contained 36 clones, who were split into 4 training squads. These cohorts stuck together as the clones aged, and when the clones graduated, their birth cohorts became platoons. These birth cohorts were very close. It was only within these units that young clones referred to each other by nicknames or expressed more individualistic aspects of their personalities in the security of their own barracks during the few breaks they got from the Kaminoans. Within these units, clones acted much more like the defectives that we all know and love, in private with those that they trust. Their fellow platoon mates were whom most clone troopers considered their brothers and nobody else. Indeed, many of the loner clone archetypes that we sometimes see in the expanded universe are simply clones that have seen the rest of their platoon killed and have been transferred to other units. They appeared cold to their fellow clones because they didn't consider their new squad mates brothers. All of their brothers were dead. By this point, you're probably wondering how units like the 501st broke from this mold at all. The answer is simple: the Jedi. Upon taking command of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Jedi were absolutely appalled by the mindset that the Kaminoans had drilled into their clones. They encouraged individuality, urging clones to take nicknames and often giving them one if they didn't have one already. And they also urged clones to do things like adopting different hairstyles or painting their armor. After a bit of adjustment, many clones warmed up to this, resulting in the type of clone that we're more familiar with. With the release and success of the ARC Troopers, the Kaminoans reluctantly began to acknowledge the wisdom in this, and became much more relaxed about fighting individuality within new clones. When the Jedi became involved in clone training, this improved even further, and the same can be said for Alpha 17's Commander retraining. Gradually, the Jedi, and some of the ARC Troopers that worked with them, humanized the clone army. Unfortunately, however, this individuality once more began to decline near the end of the Clone Wars. As more and more Jedi died and more recruited officers took their places, the emphasis on and tolerance of individuality decreased drastically. This only got worse when Spartai clones began to be injected into the Grand Army. Bred on Centax 2, this new generation of clones was bred from special Spartai cloning cylinders that allowed battle-ready soldiers to be grown in a year. However, these clone troopers were almost all simply living droids, useful en masse but distinctly inferior to their Kaminoan brethren. When the Republic became the Empire, once more individuality was more or less wiped out among clones. All armor used by the Empire's new stormtroopers was painted identically. Nicknames were once more made a private thing, and a crackdown on individual thinking began. As the ranks of the Stormtrooper Corps began to be filled mostly by natural-born recruits, Imperial training academies even began fighting individuality among them as well, assigning them clone-style numbers and punishing individual thinking. This was just one of many reasons why Imperial Stormtroopers were vastly inferior to Republic clones. So, that's why clones didn't consider each other brothers. And as per usual guys, I want to know what you think. Do you think these standard NPC clones were more effective than our more well-known defective clones, you know, en masse and everything like that? Post your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out all the links in the description below if you want to join our Geetsly's gaming network and our Discord. We've got all the links set down below, so make sure you join them if you want to join the wider Geetsly's community on Gmod, Roblox, and our Discords. And also, if you're feeling generous, check out my Patreon because it really helps me out now that I'm doing this full time. Anyways guys, as always, thank you for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.